On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from Santa Susana Pass Historic State Park in Los Angeles County, California. Tie-dye is a color of choice for this podcast because we're going back to the 1960s, actually 1969, and take a look at one of the most infamous mass murders in U.S. history. In this edition of Crime Chronicles, we look at the victims and the perpetrator. It's the Charles Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders on this edition of Crime Chronicles. On the night of August 8, 1969, four people, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, invaded the home of film director Roman Polanski and his pregnant wife, actress Sharon Tate Polanski. The house was located on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. 5 people were murdered: Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Earl Parent. The following night, in another area of Los Angeles, the same 4 killers, accompanied by Charles Manson, Steve Grogan, and Leslie Van Houten, invaded the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. They were murdered as well. The Tate LaBianca murders and at least 2 others were committed by members of a doomsday cult referred to as the Manson family, headed by 35-year-old Charles Manson. It was one of the most bizarre set of murders in U.S. history, and a violent punctuation to one of America's most turbulent decades. Most of the murders, the most famous murders committed by Charles Manson and his family, occurred in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, rather than this remote area where I am right now. But I'm here because while the Manson family was nomadic in some respects, never had a real stable residence. After all, Charles Manson was not exactly the kind of person that could go into a bank and apply for a mortgage. During their low point, or heyday, however one chooses to look at it, they lived about a half mile from here at a place called the Spahn Ranch, which is now part of this state park. The Spahn Movie Ranch, close to where I am right now, which was home to the Manson family for much of their career, was owned by a man named George Spahn, about 80 years old at the time these murders were committed. And there's no evidence whatsoever that Mr. Spahn, who was really blind, had any idea what the people who lived on his ranch with his permission were up to. He knew they probably broke the law to get food sometimes by stealing, going in the trash cans, things like that. But he had no idea he was playing home to a group of mass murderers. The Spahn Movie Ranch at one time was a ranch, a working ranch, and it still was at the time of these murders. But it was been used as a movie set through the 1930s, 1940s when Hollywood Westerns were at their heyday. And then George Spahn bought the ranch and pretty much used it solely as his home. And the Manson family persuaded him to let him stay at his ranch. In brief, what happened is something like this. In August of 1969, at the home of film director Roman Polanski, although Mr. Polanski was out of the country at the time, his wife, Sharon Tate Polanski, her former boyfriend, hairstylist Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, a social worker and heir to the Folger coffee fortune, her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, were at the Polanski house when it was invaded by several members of the Manson family. The first person to be killed that night, though, was not the 4 people I just mentioned. It was a young man, 18 years old, named Stephen Earl Parent. I'm at a restaurant in Los Angeles called El Coyote. Now, Los Angeles is no stranger and no short of Mexican restaurants in this city. After all, the original European inhabitants or conquerors, however one chooses to look at it, were the Spaniards. And of course, there's a significant Mexican-American population here, or Latino population, always has been. But this restaurant is special for several reasons. First off, it was established in 1931, so I'm not sure if there's an older restaurant in the city of LA, let alone an older Mexican or Mexican-American restaurant. More significantly for our purposes here, this was a restaurant where 4 members of the 4 victims of the Tate killings, that being Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, and Abigail Folger, had their last meal on the night they were murdered. It's unfortunate that a lot of times we remember a murder more for the names of the murderers than we do the victims. Although in this case, the name Sharon Tate Polanski, is pretty well known. It's very well associated with these murders. But we should take a look at the victims in this case, and let's start with the actress and wife of film director Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate Polanski. Born in Texas in 1943, Sharon Tate worked as a model and actress in the mid-60s. She was one of Hollywood's most promising newcomers and drew comparisons to deceased actress Marilyn Monroe. Sharon Tate appeared in several TV series, including The Beverly Hillbillies. She briefly dated one of the show's stars, Max Baer Jr. Her most acclaimed role came in the film Valley of the Dolls, which brought her a Golden Globe nomination. Her husband, Roman Polanski, was an established film director. His most notable film at that time was the horror classic Rosemary's Baby. Another victim of the Tate murders that night in August at the hands of the Manson family was a man named Jay Sebring. Jay Sebring was Sharon Tate Polanski's ex-boyfriend and also an internationally known hairstylist. Born Thomas Coomer in Alabama in 1933, Jay Sebring, as he later became known, was hairstylist to the stars in the 1960s, charging $50 for men's haircuts when most barbers charged no more than $3. He incorporated hairstyling techniques previously confined to Europe, such as blow-drying, into his hairstyling. Although they were no longer intimate at the time of their deaths, Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate Polanski remained good friends after their breakup. Another victim of the murders that night was a woman whose name should be familiar to you, particularly if you drink coffee, and that's Abigail Folger. Abigail Folger was a social worker and was also an heir to the Folger's coffee fortune. Born in San Francisco in 1943, Abigail, or Gibby Folger, was the great-granddaughter of J.A. Folger, the founder of the coffee company that bears the family name. A well-educated debutante musician, Gibby Folger devoted her life to civil rights for African Americans and to the other privilege in California. Although she had access to her family's fortune, she lived frugally compared to other wealthy heiresses. Wojciech Frykowski was the Polish boyfriend of Abigail Folger. Born in Poland in 1936, Wojciech Frykowski was a writer, financier, and an aspiring actor. In addition to being the boyfriend of Abigail Folger, Frykowski was friends with Roman Polanski and had participated in some of his film projects. The 5th victim of the Tate murders that night at the hands of the Manson family was a young man 18 years old named Stephen Earl Parent. The least affluent of the Tate murder victims, Stephen Earl Parent had recently graduated from high school and was set to enter junior college that fall. While a genius in electronics, Parent had run-ins with the law as a teen for theft, but he was working 2 jobs at the time of his death, as a delivery boy and as an electronics salesman. Why was the house owned by Roman Polanski on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles the target of the Manson family's rage that night? It had nothing to do, actually, with the people who lived there or those guests. It had to do with Charles Manson's aspirations of being a professional musician. Charles Manson was like a lot of people in the 1960s. He was enamored with rock and roll, and he had some amount of musical talent, some songwriting ability. And so he thought he had gained an entree into the music business when one day, when 2 of his female followers were out hitchhiking, and they were picked up by Dennis Wilson. Dennis Wilson was a drummer for the Beach Boys. Formed in Hawthorne, California in the early 1960s, the Beach Boys were the biggest selling American pop musicians of the early 1960s. By 1968, the Beach Boys were not as popular as they had been several years earlier, and were yet to experience their mid-1970s resurgence, but they were still among the biggest names in rock music. On April 6, 1968, Dennis Wilson was driving through Malibu when he picked up 2 female hitchhikers, Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey, and dropped them off at their destination. 5 days later, Wilson noticed the same 2 girls hitchhiking again, and this time took them to his home on Sunset Boulevard. The girls told Wilson they had a guru, a guy named Charlie, who had recently come out of jail after 12 years. One night soon after, Wilson was met in his driveway by Charles Manson, and when Wilson walked into his home, about a dozen people were occupying the premises, most of them young women. Over the next few months, members of the Manson family, mostly women who were treated as servants, were housed in Wilson's residence. Dennis Wilson, by far the wildest and most untamed member of the Beach Boys, was no stranger to heavy drug use and loose sex, so he enjoyed his association with the Manson family for a time.
At first, Dennis Wilson was not exactly a fan, but he was not scared of Charles Manson, and they got along pretty well. But the Manson family, as they did, began to encroach on Dennis Wilson and even moved into his house without his okay. But it got to a point where Dennis Wilson was afraid to say no to Charles Manson. It also got to the point where Charles Manson bullied or convinced Dennis Wilson into introducing him, I should say, to a music producer. The guy's name was Terry Melcher. Terry Melcher produced a lot of groups back in the 1960s. He was also the son of actress Doris Day. And so the Manson family, or Charles Manson, got an audition with Terry Melcher, but Terry Melcher effectively said, "Don't call us, we'll call you." And so the reason the Polanski house was targeted that night was because it was the same house that had formerly been owned and lived in by Terry Melcher.
Manson recorded several songs at the home of Dennis's older brother and fellow Beach Boy Brian, with the assistance of Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher. In September 1968, the Beach Boys recorded a Manson song called "Cease to Exist," but reworked it as "Never Learn Not to Love," which was released the following December. The song was credited to Dennis Wilson in exchange for gifts to Manson. Wilson eventually distanced himself from Manson and moved out of his Sunset Boulevard house, leaving the family there, and he moved to a basement apartment in Santa Monica. Virtually all of Wilson's household possessions were stolen by the family, and the members were evicted from his home. When Manson subsequently sought further contact, he left a bullet with Wilson's housekeeper to be delivered with a threatening message. By this time, Dennis Wilson feared Charles Manson and suspected him of killing people. Manson had visited the Polanski home prior to the murders. On March 23, 1969, he showed up uninvited looking for Terry Melcher, but was told by people working at the home that Melcher no longer worked there. It turned out that Manson had been to the home several times prior, each time looking for Terry Melcher.
Charles Manson was one of the most infamous mass murderers in American history, certainly one of the most infamous mass murderers of the 20th century. First question to look at here, perhaps, is who was Charles Manson, and how did this man who stood no more than 5 feet 2 inches tall become the infamous figure that he is, and how did he gain control of the minds of so many people?
Charles Maddox was born on November 12, 1934, to 16-year-old Ada Maddox in Cincinnati. Charles Manson never knew his biological father. Charles Manson's extremely dysfunctional childhood laid the foundation for a life of crime. Just before Charlie was born, Ada Maddox married William Manson, a laborer at a dry cleaning business. Charles Manson was neglected as a child while his mother and stepfather went on drinking binges. After Ada's divorce, Charles Manson kept his stepfather's last name. While his mother was in prison for robbery, Charles Manson was placed in the home of an aunt and uncle in West Virginia, where his mother joined them after being paroled. Charlie Manson was frequently truant from his Charleston schools. He and his mother moved to Indiana, where Ada remarried. In an interview with Diane Sawyer, Charlie Manson said that when he was age 9, he set fire to his school. He also got repeatedly in trouble for petty theft. In 1947, at the age of 13, Manson was placed in a Catholic reform school in Terre Haute, Indiana. Wanting to escape the strict rules and corporal punishment at the school, Charles Manson ran away and lived on the streets. It was in Indianapolis in 1948 where Manson committed his first documented crime by robbing a grocery store. In 1949, he was sent to a juvenile facility in Omaha for theft. He left the facility and committed a series of armed robberies, for which he was sent to a reform school in Indiana, where he was allegedly raped by other inmates. Manson developed a knack for feigning madness as a defense mechanism, something he used as an adult. He escaped in 1951 and commenced robbing filling stations while driving west, eventually being arrested in Utah. As his crimes now involved crossing state lines, Manson was imprisoned at a federal juvenile facility in Washington, D.C. It was determined he had an IQ of 109, just above average, and was aggressively antisocial. Manson was transferred in October 1951 to a minimum security institution in Virginia, where he was caught raping a boy at knife point. He was sent to 2 other federal facilities where he continued his aggressive behavior but was released in 1954. In January 1955, Manson married a hospital waitress named Rosie Willis. He stole a car in Ohio and was arrested with his pregnant wife in Los Angeles. He received a 5-year probation sentence. His probation was eventually revoked and he was imprisoned in California. While Manson was in prison, Rosalie gave birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr. Upon his release in 1958, Manson, now divorced, began pimping teenage girls. He was sentenced to 2 years probation for forgery. He married again, this time to a woman with a history of prostitution. Manson's probation was revoked, and he was ordered to serve 10 years. During his imprisonment in Washington State, he took guitar lessons from notorious Depression-era bank robber Alvin Creepy Karpis. By the time of his release on March 21, 1967, Charles Manson, now divorced again, has spent more than half of his 32 years in prisons and other institutions.
Before finally making his way to Los Angeles, Charles Manson lived in a number of places, especially in San Francisco and Berkeley, a couple hundred miles north of here.
Manson moved to Berkeley, California, where he was placed under the supervision of criminology researcher and federal probation officer Roger Smith. It was there, in nearby San Francisco, that Manson became immersed in the booming counterculture and where he first took LSD. Manson eventually moved to the Haight-Ashbury district, the center of American counterculture, where he began to study philosophy and Scientology, and he continued his use of LSD. The summer of 1967, which has been called the Summer of Love, was pivotal in Manson's development. He enjoyed the lax attitudes toward drug use and polyamorous sexual aspects of the San Francisco counterculture. By some accounts, the Haight-Ashbury district was a haven for enlightenment and peaceful coexistence. But by other accounts, including that of one of Manson's musical idols, George Harrison of the Beatles, who visited the Haight, the area was nothing more than a skid row for burnout kids and drug addicts. Charles Manson's fascination with the Beatles developed. They had just released the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the unofficial anthem of the Summer of Love. Manson also devoted himself to studying the Bible, especially the apocalyptic passages in the book of Revelation. While in San Francisco, Manson established himself as a sort of guru to some of the young, impressionable people there. He moved in with Mary Bruner, a 23-year-old library assistant. Manson then met teenage runaway Lynette Fromm, whom he called Squeaky, and convinced her to live with him and Bruner. Eventually, 18 women were living with Bruner and Charles Manson.
While Charles Manson was living a life of crime, even as a youth, in the American Midwest, many of his followers, some were following a similar trajectory in life, but others, it didn't seem to make sense because quite a few of his other followers came from stable middle class backgrounds. But this was the 1960s, and teen rebellion perhaps was at its peak during that time.
Manson targeted runaways, young people who felt like outcasts, or who were emotionally insecure. Lynette Squeaky Fromm was the daughter of an affluent aeronautical engineer and had once appeared as a dancer on the Lawrence Welk Show before rebelling against her parents and leaving home. Mary Bruner was a product of a stable middle-class Wisconsin family and a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. Charles Watson, called Tex for his Texas roots, was a high school honor student, football star, devoted churchgoer, and former fraternity member at North Texas State College in Denton before moving to California and getting involved with Manson. Bobby Beausoleil, a former musician and pornographic actor, came from a middle-class Catholic family but had several run-ins with the law as a teen. Susan Atkins was born in California and grew up in a troubled middle-class home. Patricia Krenwinkel was born to a middle-class family in California and aspired to become a nun, but she suffered from poor self-esteem and was bullied in high school. Ruth Ann Morehouse was born in Canada, the daughter of a Protestant minister, and was introduced to Manson by her minister father, something he no doubt regretted later on. Leslie Van Houten was a product of a middle-class California family who drifted into teen rebellion and drug use before meeting Charles Manson. Manson taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians and that the establishment were modern Romans. Manson attempted to reprogram his followers by having them totally submit to his will with LSD and unconventional sexual practices that would turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept anything he poured. All female entrants to the family were required to have sex with Manson. Manson would encourage group LSD trips and take lower doses himself to keep his wits about him. In the fall of 1967, Manson and his followers settled in the Los Angeles area. Mary Bruner gave birth to Charles Manson's son there, and Los Angeles was where the most infamous crimes would occur.
On that August 1969 night on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, the first person to be killed by the Manson family was a young man, 18 years old, named Stephen Earl Parent. Now, Stephen Parent had no connection to the four people that were later killed inside the house. He was an audiophile, and he had recently befriended a man named William Garretson. Garretson was a caretaker at the Polanski house, and Parent was coming to visit Garretson so they could talk about audio equipment. And Parent was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
On the night of August 8, 1969, Charles Tex Watson took Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to the Polanski home on Cielo Drive. Watson later claimed that Manson had instructed him to go to the house and totally destroy everyone in it, and to do it as gruesome as you can. Manson told the women to do as Watson instructed them. Tex Watson and the three women arrived at the Polanski mansion just past midnight on August 9th. Watson climbed the telephone pole near the entrance gate and cut the phone line to the house. The group then backed their car to the bottom of the hill that led to the estate before walking back up to the house. Thinking the gate might be electrified or equipped with an alarm, they climbed a brushy embankment to the right of the gate and entered the grounds. Seeing approaching headlights, Watson ordered the women to line the bushes. He stepped out and told the approaching driver, Stephen Parent, to halt. Watson aimed a .22 caliber revolver at Parent, who begged for his life. Watson slashed Parent with a knife and shot him 4 times, killing him in the front seat of his car. Watson entered the Polanski house through a window and let Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door, while Linda Kasabian stood by Stephen Parent's car. He awoke Wojciech Frykowski, who was sleeping on the living room couch. Watson kicked him in the head, and Frykowski asked him who he was and what he was doing there. Watson replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel forced Folger, Sharon Tate, and Sebring into the living room. Watson began to tie Tate and Sebring together by their necks with a long nylon rope which he had brought, then slung it over one of the living room's ceiling beams. Sebring protested the rough treatment of the pregnant Tate, so Watson shot him. Abigail Folger was taken back to her bedroom for her purse, and she gave the murderers $70. Watson then stabbed Jay Sebring 7 times. Frykowski's hands had been bound with a towel, but he freed himself and began struggling with Atkins, who stabbed at his legs with a knife. Wojciech Frykowski fought hard for his life, struggling across the lawn, but Watson continued to stab him. Frykowski suffered 51 stab wounds. He had also been struck 13 times in the head with the butt of Watson's gun. Abigail Folger escaped from Patricia Krenwinkel and fled out a bedroom door to the pool area. Krenwinkel pursued her and caught her in the front lawn, where she stabbed her and tackled her to the ground. Watson then helped kill her. Her assailants stabbed her a total of 28 times. Sharon Tate Polanski, who was over 8 months pregnant, pleaded to be allowed to live long enough to give birth and offer herself as a hostage to her save the life of her unborn child. Instead, both Susan Atkins, who said, "Look, bitch, I have no mercy for you," and Charles Watson stabbed Tate 16 times, killing her and her unborn child. Sharon Tate was still alive when she was hanged with a nylon rope, although the cause of her death was determined as a massive hemorrhage. While at Sebring's murder, it was found he was hanged lifeless. Manson had told the women to leave a sign, something witchy. Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood. This was done to make authorities believe that black militants had committed the murders, as militant blacks often referred to rich white people as pigs, in the hopes of igniting the race war that Manson was hoping to launch. That morning, the Polanski's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, arrived for work. She was soon seen running down the driveway, screaming death and murder.
William Garretson was a caretaker at the Polanski house that night, and it's incredible to think about this. But while all this mayhem and murder was going on around him, he literally slept through the entire episode. He was in his quarters, which is off the mansion, and the killers had no idea that he was there. As I said a while ago, Garretson was an audiophile, and he was listening to music, and either was listening to music and or asleep while these murders were going on. Well, not surprisingly, the next morning, the first person the police took into custody was William Garretson. But it became apparent that he was simply very lucky and knew nothing about these murders. The Tate murders generated panic throughout Los Angeles and Southern California, as you might guess. And one of the first things that police officers looked for was a motive, some kind of connection between the murder victims and their killers. And one of the first suspicions was perhaps this was a drug deal gone bad. It turned out that some of the people at the house had used marijuana that night, but that part of the story dried up pretty quickly. When Tex Watson and the female members of the Manson family who killed the 5 people at the Polanski mansion returned, Charles Manson was not happy about the way they carried it out. And so he decided to go with them on the next outing and sort of show them how it was supposed to be done. The following night, in another area of Los Angeles, Charles Manson himself, along with some of his followers, arrived at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Supposedly, Charles Manson went inside the house and tied the LaBiancas up, went back outside and told his followers, okay, now I've done my job, you go do yours. And so the LaBianca couple, who was Leno LaBianca, was the owner of a chain of grocery stores here in LA. So like the Polanskis, although he was not famous, he was very well to do. The 5 victims of the Tate murders on Cielo Drive died not knowing who their killers were, what the motive was. The same can be said for Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. But in the case of the Tate murders, there was a connection, albeit very indirect. Well, what was the connection? Why the LaBiancas so unfortunate to have their house picked out? Almost solely by chance, except it turned out several months earlier, the Manson family had been at a party at the house of the next door neighbors to the LaBiancas. Well, I'm standing now on Waverly Drive in Los Angeles, the wall behind me, of course. The home that was the scene of the Tate murders, owned by Roman Polanski, was torn down several years ago, and the address was changed as well for understandable reasons. But the home that was owned by Leno and Rosemary LaBianca is still standing, and it's behind me here, although it's gated.
Little is known about 43-year-old Rosemary LaBianca, other than she owned the dress shop, had been married once before her marriage to 44-year-old Leno, and that she was born in Mexico, but lived in the U.S. since her youth, and had been adopted by an American family as a child. On this night, the 4 Tate murderers, Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian, were joined by Charles Manson, Leslie Van Houten, and Steve Clem Grogan. Manson told Kasabian to drive to a house on Waverly Drive in Los Angeles. After Manson and Tex Watson tied the LaBiancas up at gunpoint and returned to the driveway, Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten entered the property while Grogan, Kasabian, and Manson stayed in the car. Watson covered the couple's heads with pillowcases, which he bound in place with lamp cords. Watson began stabbing Leno LaBianca with a chrome-plated bayonet. Watson heard a scuffle in the bedroom and went in there to discover Rosemary LaBianca keeping the women at bay by swinging the lamp tied to her neck. He stabbed her several times with the bayonet, then returned to the living room and resumed attacking Leno, who he stabbed a total of 12 times. He then carved the word war into LaBianca's abdomen, another fake reference to black militants. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten stabbed Rosemary LaBianca 41 times. Some of the wounds were post-mortem. Watson then cleaned off the bayonet and showered, while Krenwinkel wrote, "Rise and death to pigs," on the walls in LaBianca's blood. Patricia Krenwinkel gave Leno LaBianca 14 puncture wounds with an ivory-handled, 2-tinned carving fork, which she left jutting out of his stomach. She also planted a steak knife in his throat. Meanwhile, Charles Manson had driven away from the LaBianca house with Steve Grogan and Linda Kasabian. Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten were left to hitchhike home. The LaBianca's bodies were discovered at 10:30 p.m. on August 10th, approximately 19 hours after the murders were committed, when 15-year-old Frank Struthers, Rosemary's son from a prior marriage, returned from a camping trip.
Another murder victim of the Manson family was a man named Gary Hinman, who made the mistake of befriending some of the Manson family members, particularly a man named Bobby Beausoleil.
To follow the investigation to the Tate LaBianca murders, it is necessary to examine a murder that occurred on July 27, 1969, several days before the Tate LaBianca murders. Although the Tate murders have a higher profile, the murder of 34-year-old Gary Allen Hinman, a music teacher and graduate student at UCLA, preceded those killings and provided a vital link to them. Gary Hinman had befriended members of the Manson family and allowed some to occasionally stay at his home in Topanga Canyon. Manson believed Hinman had recently received a sizable inheritance and sent Susan Atkins, Mary Bruner, and Bobby Beausoleil to Hinman's home to convince him to join the family and turn over his money to them. The three held Hinman hostage for 2 days in late July 1969 as he denied having any money. During this time, Manson arrived with a sword and slashed Hinman's face and ear. After that, Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death, per Manson's instruction. Beau Salil, or one of the women, used Hinman's blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall and to draw a panther paw, a Black Panther symbol, a false signal to law enforcement that black militants had killed Hinman. Bobby Beau Salil was arrested on August 6, 1969, after he was caught driving Hinman's car. Police found the murder weapon in the tire well. On August 10th, detectives of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which was investigating the murder of Gary Hinman, told Los Angeles Police Department detectives assigned to the Tate case of the bloody writing on the Hinman house. But LAPD detectives believed the Tate murders were a consequence of a drug transaction, so they initially ignored this and other similarities between the Tate and Hinman murders.
So now there are the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders. Now, nowadays, when those two sets of murders are mentioned, they're almost mentioned synonymously as one, the Tate LaBianca murders. But for the first several weeks or even months after they were committed, law enforcement really had no idea the two were connected, despite some similarities in the MO.
On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told the press it had ruled out any connection between the Tate and LaBianca homicides. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca team checked with the sheriff's office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. They learned of the Hinman case and that the Hinman detectives had spoken with Beau Salil's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger. She had been arrested a few days earlier with members of the Manson family. In a report at the end of August, the LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca house and the Beatles' most recently released album, the White Album.
It might be understandable that police officers had a hard time putting this case together, because very often in the case of a murder, there's some kind of connection or some kind of clear motive that ties the killers to the victims. In this case, the motive was so bizarre that even most film writers could not concoct a scheme like this. I'd heard of the Charles Manson murders almost from the time they happened, but my first real education into finding out more about the Manson murders, the Manson family, was through a book called Helter Skelter. It came out in the mid-1970s, written chiefly by the chief prosecutor in the case, Vincent Bugliosi. The book opens with this line. It says, "This story will scare the hell out of you." And it did. Like a lot of people back in the 1960s, even today, Charles Manson was a big fan of the Beatles. One album in particular really took a perverse hold on Charles Manson, and that was an album officially called The Beatles, informally called the White Album because of its solid white cover. Charles Manson became convinced that the Beatles, through almost every song on that White Album, were sending hidden messages to him, and he convinced his followers of that same thing. Now, there were several songs that really grabbed his imagination particularly. One was a song called Blackbird, which was primarily written by Paul McCartney. Blackbird was actually a song about advocating civil rights for African Americans, but not through violent means. Another song was one called Piggies, in which George Harrison mocks the snobby upper class, and at one point says, what they need is a damn good whacking. But again, he wasn't speaking literally as in killing these people, but Charles Manson took it differently. Another song was called Revolution 1, which called for social change. Also a song or a montage called Revolution 9, but the song that really grabbed Charles Manson's imagination was one called Helter Skelter. Now, Helter Skelter was written primarily by Paul McCartney, kind of their precursor to heavy metal in a way, and it was about an amusement park slide in England. But Charles Manson took it to mean something much more than that.
The Beatles' White Album was released in November 1968. Manson referred to his self-declared pending race war as Helter Skelter, taken from a song on side 3 of the White Album. The Manson family evolved into a doomsday cult when Manson became fixated on the idea of an imminent apocalyptic race war between America's black and white populations. And like most doomsday cultists, he tried to precipitate the doomsday he predicted. A white supremacist, Manson told the family that black people would rise and kill the entire white population. During this war, the Manson family, with him as chief prophet, and the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, as the other 4 prophets, would find shelter in the bowels of the earth below Death Valley in Southern California, and emerge to lead the victorious black race once the war was over. Blacks, in Manson's view, were not intelligent enough to survive with their own. They would need a white man, namely him and the Beatles, to lead them.
Charles Manson and his followers are no stranger to law enforcement in Los Angeles, both before and after the murders, in unrelated crimes. In fact, Some members of the family, including Manson, were taken into custody after the murders were committed for separate crimes.
On August 16th, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department raided Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 others as suspects in a major auto theft ring. Weapons were seized, but because the search warrant had been misdated, the group was released a few days later.
Police got a break when one of the killers, a Manson family member, Susan Atkins, was in jail for another crime and started bragging about the murders to some fellow inmates.
Not long after the raid at Spahn Ranch, the Manson family was arrested again, this time at Barker Ranch. Susan Atkins was one of those arrested. While she was incarcerated on these charges, police linked her to the murder of Gary Hinman, to which she confessed. Susan Atkins also told two fellow inmates, Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, that she had participated in the Tate LaBianca murders. Howard and Graham told detectives about her confession.
Although the Tate LaBianca murders were the most infamous that were committed by the Manson family, they were not by any stretch of the imagination the only ones committed by the Manson family. In fact, believe it or not, as I was filming this, a couple walked by and we struck up a brief conversation. And the man who walked by with his wife is a historian. He told me of something I'd never heard before, and that was the Manson family rented a house in Los Angeles for about a year, and they called it the Yellow Submarine after the Beatles song was painted yellow. Several years after they were all incarcerated, or some were incarcerated, police officers sent dogs to the property and unearthed some bones of some murder victims that no one knows who they were. There were other murders committed by the Manson family. One here at Spahn Ranch. The victim was a man named Donald Shorty Shea, who was a Spahn Ranch hand and an aspiring actor.
35-year-old Hollywood stuntman Donald Shorty Shea was murdered on August 26, 1969, more than 2 weeks after the Tate LaBianca murders. Manson told Shea, Bruce Davis, Tex Watson, and Steve Grogan to go on a ride to a nearby car parts yard on the Spahn Ranch. Davis sat in the back seat with Grogan, who then hit Shea with a pipe wrench, and Watson stabbed him. They brought Shea down a hill behind the ranch and stabbed and tortured him to death. In December 1977, Shea's skeletal remains were discovered on a hillside near Santa Susana Road next to Spahn Ranch, after Steve Grogan agreed to aid authorities in the recovery of Shea's body by drawing a map to its location.
Well, as I've said, there were a number of murders that the Manson family committed or allegedly committed that were not associated with the Tate LaBianca murders, for example, and some never came to the attention of authorities, although we can never really be sure. But several years ago, Mike Love, the frontman and lead singer for the Beach Boys, the Beach Boys, their core was composed of 5 men. There were 3 brothers, Brian Wilson, his younger brothers, Carl and Dennis being the middle child, and their cousin, Mike Love, and Brian Wilson's high school football friend, Alan Jardine. Now, Dennis Wilson drowned. He died back in 1983, but he had an unfortunate association with the Manson family through really unintentionally. He didn't really know how bad the Mansons were, but maybe he did. But at some point, he became very scared of Charles Manson. Mike Love, his cousin and bandmate, several years ago, released a book. And in the book, he claimed that Dennis Wilson told him that he witnessed Charles Manson shoot an African-American man at the Spahn Ranch and throw his body in a well. Was that true or not? According to some, this may have been a delusion on Dennis Wilson's part, because some have maintained there were no wells there. On the other hand, I just spoke with a historian who knows that area very well, who asserts very firmly there were wells on the property. So the exact body count that can be traced to the Manson family probably would never be known for sure, because the number of the people that they killed, the Tate LaBianca murders notwithstanding, were people that were not very well known or had no connections to anybody, or homeless or vagabonds like some of the Manson family members were.
Charles Manson repeatedly claimed to have killed many others, by some sources as many as 35 people. For example, Tex Watson became involved in drug dealing and robbed a 22-year-old drug dealing rival named Bernard Crowe. Crowe threatened to kill everyone at Spahn Ranch. In response, Manson shot Crowe on July 1, 1969 at Manson's Hollywood apartment. Manson mistakenly believed that Crowe was a member of the Black Panthers and expected retaliation for the Panthers. Manson brought in members of the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club to act as security at Spahn Ranch. John Philip Haught, 22, joined the Manson family and was among the group who was arrested in the October raid of the Klan for the Tate LaBianca murders. Manson suspected him of being an informant. On November 5, 1969, Haught was associating with some members of the family. While there was some suspicion that the Manson family had killed Haught, the official cause of death was suicide, as family members said he was playing Russian roulette. On December 1, 1969, the LAPD announced warrants for the arrest of Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian in the Tate case. The suspects' involvement in the LaBianca murders was noted. Charles Manson and Susan Atkins were already in custody. Leslie Van Houten's involvement will be discovered later. Patricia Krenwinkel was in custody in Alabama. Tex Watson was under arrest in his home state of Texas. Linda Kasabian turned herself into authorities in New Hampshire when she learned of the warrant for her arrest.
Between the time they were arrested and the time they went to trial, the Manson family and Charles Manson in particular became perverse media celebrities, as often happens in cases like this.
In June 1970, Rolling Stone made Manson their cover story. He also covered the pages of various left-wing radical publications. Bernadine Dorn of the Weather Underground said of the Tate murders, "Dig it. First, they killed those pigs. Then they ate dinner in the same room with them. Then they even shoved a fork into Pig Tate's stomach. Wild." In addition to Manson's followers, some young people gathered outside the Los Angeles County Courthouse during the trial, sporting Manson t-shirts that named Manson Man of the Year and referred to him as Jesus Christ, a name he used for himself.
It should come as no surprise that Charles Manson and his followers who were on trial for these murders little respect for law and order or for the American court system. In fact, the trial was a circus itself.
The trial began on June 15, 1970, led by Assistant District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi. The prosecution's main witness was Linda Kasabian, who, along with Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel, had been charged with the 7 Tate LaBianca murders. Since Linda Kasabian, by all accounts, had not actually participated in the killings, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony that detailed the nights of the crimes. Critics of the deal maintained that Kasabian got away with murder. Originally, a deal had also been made with Susan Atkins, in which the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty against her in exchange for her grand jury testimony on which the indictments were secured. When Atkins repudiated that testimony, the deal was withdrawn. Because Leslie Van Houten had participated only in the LaBianca killings, she was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Originally, Judge William Keene, who would later gain fame for his role in the fictionalized court show Divorce Court, granted Manson permission to act as his own attorney, but the motion was withdrawn before the trial started, and Judge Keene was replaced by Judge Charles Older. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the murders, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. The prosecution argued the triggering of Helter Skelter was Manson's main motive. The crime scene's bloody White Album reference, Helter Skelter Blood, and the writing of pigs was correlated with testimony about Manson predictions that the murders black people would commit at the outset of Helter Skelter would involve the writing of pigs on walls in victims' blood. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead and stated he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself, and had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants duplicated the mark on their foreheads, as did most family members within a day or so. During the trial, family members loitered at the entrances and corridors of the courthouse. To keep them out of the courtroom, the prosecution subpoenaed them as prospective witnesses, who would not be able to enter while others were testifying. When the group established itself in vigil on the sidewalk, some members wore sheathed hunting knives that, although in plain view, were carried legally. Some family members attempted to dissuade witnesses from testifying. Prosecution witnesses Paul Watkins and Juan Flynn were both threatened. Watkins was badly burned in a suspicious fire in his van. Former family member Barbara Hoyt, who had overheard Susan Atkins describing the Tate murders, was given a hamburger spiked with LSD by family member Ruth Morehouse while visiting Hawaii. This stiffened her resolve to testify against Manson. On August 4th, Charles Manson flashed the jury a Los Angeles Times front page, whose headline was, "Manson Guilty, Nixon Declares." The previous day, President Richard Nixon had decried what he saw as the media's glamorization of Manson. Judge Charles Older ruled the headline had not influenced the jury. The next day, the female defendants, who were frequently filmed smiling and singing both in and out of the courtroom, stood up and said in unison that considering Nixon's remark, there was no point in going on with the trial. On October 5th, when Judge Older made a ruling against Manson, Manson leapt over the defense table to attack him. Manson was removed from the courtroom with the female defendants, who had risen and begun chanting in Latin. On November 16th, the prosecution rested its case. 3 days later, after arguing standard dismissal motions, the defense stunned the court by resting as well, without calling a single witness. Shouting their disapproval, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten demanded their right to testify.
And Charles Manson, while he cared little for the lives of other people, including his followers, by the way, he kept trying to convince them to more or less fall on their sword for his benefit. He fought very hard for his own life, although he had no regard for anyone else's.
In chambers, the women's lawyers told the judge their clients wanted to testify that they had planned to commit the crimes and that Manson had not been involved. By resting their case, the defense lawyers had tried to stop this. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi believed Manson advised the women to testify in this way to save himself. In 1987, Patricia Krenwinkel, by then disassociated from Manson, said that Charles Manson was directing her and the other defendants' actions. While Charles Manson had no regard for the lives of others, he fought very hard for his own. The next day, Manson testified. The jury was removed from the courtroom so as not to violate a California court ruling that disallowed making statements implicating a co-defendant. Speaking for more than an hour, Manson said, among other things, that the music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment. He said, "Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music." With the closing arguments impending, defense attorney Ronald Hughes, who was representing Leslie Van Houten, disappeared during a weekend trip. Hughes had stood up to Manson when Manson argued over Leslie Van Houten's not testifying on his behalf. Hughes' death was ruled an accident, and no one was ever charged, but many suspected the Manson family of killing him, as an angry Charles Manson had just told Hughes that he would never set foot in a courtroom again. One Manson family member said that Hughes' death was a retaliation murder. Soon after the trial resumed with a new attorney for Van Houten, during the prosecution's closing arguments, Judge Older banished the defendants from the courtroom for the repeated antics and disruptions.
Charles Manson and some of his female followers involved in the Tate-Labiaka murders were the first ones tried. They were all convicted and sentenced to death.
On January 25, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the 4 defendants. Midway through the penalty phase, Manson shaved his head and trimmed his beard to a fork. He told the press, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." On March 29, 1971, the jury returned verdicts of death against all 4 defendants on all counts. On April 19, 1971, Judge Older sentenced the 4 to death.
Well, although Charles Manson was sort of the mastermind of the Tate-Labiaka murders, Tex Watson was sort of the man on the ground, if you will, who actually carried these out and led the murders themselves. By the time the other members of the Manson family were on trial, Tex Watson had fled the state and had to be extradited, so Tex Watson was tried separately. He also was convicted and sentenced to death.
Charles Manson was admitted to state prison from Los Angeles County on April 22, 1971, for 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of Abigail Folger, Wojciech Rakowski, Stephen Earl Parent, Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, and Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. On December 13, 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder in Los Angeles County Court for the July 25, 1969 death of musician Gary Hinman. He was also convicted of first-degree murder for the August 1969 death of Donald Shea. In total, Charles Manson was convicted of 9 murders.
But the Manson family would not spend very much time on death row in California. In 1972, the California Supreme Court overturned the death penalty as being unconstitutional. Not long after that, the U.S. Supreme Court did the same thing, and so all murderers on death row in California had their sentences commuted to life in prison, and then a few months later, every death row inmate in the United States had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Well, like I say, I'm wearing tie-dye here because tie-dye, although it's still popular with some people, was particularly popular back in the 1960s. It was kind of the unofficial color of the counterculture. Counterculture was supposed to be about peace and love and nonviolence. And some people saw the Manson family murders as a violent signature to the 1960s, to the end of the 1960s.
While many conservatives doubted the sincerity of the peace and love anthems of the late 1960s, there are many idealists who hoped they were paving the way for a more peaceful, egalitarian, and less militaristic America. But the Manson murders, coupled with other violent incidents such as the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, violent anti-war protests, the assassinations of Senator Robert Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., and the deadly encounter between Hells Angels motorcycle thugs and attendees at the Altamont Music Festival in California seemed to dash those hopes. The tie-dyed dream of American utopia was over.
So the aftermath. What happened to the Manson family members who were convicted of these crimes?
Charles Tex Watson, during his imprisonment, has supposedly undergone a complete transformation from the Charles Watson he was before he was in prison. He has established a ministry. He consistently maintains he is a born-again Christian. He is ashamed of his actions with the Manson family. Susan Atkins, who was also convicted, one of the convicted killers, likewise underwent a spiritual transformation of sorts while in prison. Now the question is was that transformation sincere, and should it matter? Leslie Van Houten was another convicted murderer in the Manson crimes, and as of this recording, she is the only member of the Manson family to have actually been released on parole that was involved with these murders, at least. Patricia Krenwinkel, another member of the Manson family involved in the Tate LaBianca murders, has renounced her actions, her attitudes towards Charles Manson, and remains in prison as of this recording. Steve Grogan, known as Clem, after all the Manson family members were given a new name by Charlie, who called himself Jesus Christ, upon entree into the Manson family. Steve Grogan, or Clem, was judged by some people as being either too much under the influence of drugs or perhaps even mentally challenged to fully understand the consequences of what he had done that night. Steve Grogan was paroled and released in the 1980s.
Steve Grogan was present at the scene of the LaBianca murders but did not participate. Linda Kasabian, the star witness who played a pivotal role in the security convictions of her fellow Manson family members, was present at the scene of both the Tate LaBianca murders but supposedly did not participate. Linda Kasabian died in 2023 at age 73.
The so-called Manson family was not confined just to the people who committed these Tate LaBianca murders and the others. There were several other family members, quite a few actually, who were never at least alleged to have been involved in a murder. What about them? One in particular, a woman named Lynette Squeaky Fromm, made her own history about 4 or 5 years later with the attempted assassination of President Gerald Ford in Sacramento. It was in 1975, and all of the convicted murderers in the Tate LaBianca killings and other Manson-related murders were all imprisoned. And Lynette Squeaky Fromm moved from Los Angeles to Sacramento for this reason, because Charles Manson was incarcerated at nearby Folsom Prison. So Lynette Squeaky Fromm and another family member, Sandra Good, moved to Sacramento to be closer to Charlie Manson. And that's when Lynette Squeaky Fromm made her own history.
On September 5th, 1975, the Manson family returned to national attention when Lynette Squeaky Fromm attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford. Fromm was hoping to bring the spotlight on Charles Manson, to give him an opportunity to spout his apocalyptic message again, and to bring attention to the plight of California redwoods. Fromm was sentenced to 15 years to life, becoming the first person sentenced under a statute which made it a federal crime to attempt to assassinate the President of the United States. In December 1987, Fromm escaped from a federal prison in West Virginia. She was trying to reach Manson because she had heard that he had testicular cancer. She was apprehended within days. She was paroled on August 14, 2009. In recent interviews and documentaries, Fromm has stated that she never lost her love for Charles Manson. Fromm's attempt to shoot President Ford is the subject of another Crime Chronicles episode.
Before his death, Charles Manson came up for parole many times. Not surprisingly, every time his application for parole was denied. And in some cases, it got to the point where Charles Manson would not bother showing up for parole hearings. But the parole hearings that were recorded, some of which are on YouTube, give us some kind of insight in exactly what kind of person mentality Charles Manson had after his imprisonment.
Charles Manson granted several interviews during his imprisonment to NBC's Tom Snyder, CBS's Charlie Rose, Nicholas Schreck, and to the shallow, muckraking sensationalist Geraldo Rivera. On September 25, 1984, Manson was imprisoned in the California medical facility at Vacaville when an inmate poured paint thinner on him and set him on fire, causing second and third degree burns on over 20% of his body. In June 1997, a prison disciplinary committee found that Manson had been trafficking drugs. After his March 27, 1997 parole hearing, Manson refused to attend any of his later hearings. The panel noted that Manson had a history of controlling behavior, had mental health issues, including schizophrenia and paranoid delusional disorder, and was too great a danger to be released. Manson had received 108 rules violations reports, had no indication of remorse, no insight to the causative factor of his crimes, lacked understanding of the magnitude of his crimes, had an exceptional callous disregard for human suffering, and had no parole plans. In 2014, the imprisoned Manson became engaged to 26-year-old Afton Burton and obtained a marriage license. The wedding was canceled after Manson discovered that Burton wanted to marry him only so that she and a friend could use his corpse as a tourist attraction after his death. While an inmate at Corcoran Prison, Charles Manson died due to complications from colon cancer on November 19, 2017 in Bakersfield, California. He was 83.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.